All right, can everybody hear me okay? If you would like to, feel free. Some of these graphics may be a little bit tough to see from maybe midway back. So if any time you want to just move on up, you're certainly welcome to do that to a first or second row. And then in addition to that, we can certainly email this presentation to anybody that might want a copy to review on your computer afterward. So it's 6 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome, first of all, to City Hall. Thank you for coming tonight. This is the first of 2 public information meetings. The second is next Thursday. So they'll be identical in content, but certainly if you want to come back, we're happy to have you back. In addition to that, we're broadcasting live on YouTube, and I think we have some participants maybe on YouTube. So 5 participants. So if you have questions on YouTube, please type those in and we'll get to those as well. But thank you for coming out on such an important topic for the city and for your neighborhood. We're reminded on days like today how critical stormwater management is. I never imagined that the night we picked, we would have such a strong chance of rain and a squall line coming in. So we'll try to get through this as quick as we can, but still cover the content so that we can get you back home before it comes in. First of all, I want you to know, by the way, I'm Andrew Parker. I think I know most of you. I'm the city administrator, formerly the public works director. So stormwater is near and dear to me because I've spent, as our current public works staff does, many sleepless nights getting phone calls from different folks about roadway drainage structures on private property that we've tried to respond to. And so I want you to know that the city has prioritized stormwater management within the last few years because we realize it's such an infrastructure need for the city as we move forward into the future. I want you to know that funds have been allocated for projects that have been years in the making. Grant submittals, we're going to talk about that tonight, have been made for various projects. I'm not just talking about your neighborhood. I just want to kind of convey the city's stormwater program to you. Proactive studies that we've done, but we're ready to take the next steps. And we're going to talk about some projects tonight related to your neighborhood and throughout the city where we've taken those next steps. What I always tell folks is Dalton was established in 1847, but it was not required by law to have a stormwater ordinance until 2006. So that's 150 years of development with no effort really to control the design of stormwater management on commercial development, private, residential properties. And so I just say that to say it's the reason why we put this approach in place to develop a program is because it's a big task to try to dig out of 150 years of development with very little stormwater management. And we're not unlike any other city. I mean, a lot of other cities are in the same situation we are and probably are not as far ahead as we are in taking those next actionable steps. We want to develop a 21st century stormwater management strategy. So to do that, about 2 years ago, we evaluated different engineering firms across the state of Georgia, and really the whole Southeast, to try to find a partner to help us get through this. We wanted the best technical experts to help us put us in a position to develop a plan because we couldn't do this on our own. We also talked with cities across the state because Dalton was considered a phase 2 city. I told you in 2006, we had to develop a stormwater management ordinance, but there were bigger cities, more urban cities in the Atlanta area and across the state that had to develop programs about 10 years ahead of that. They were phase 1 cities. And so we talked to experts around the state and how they were addressing stormwater. And ultimately, we retained the firm Arcadis, who is really an international renowned group related to all segments of engineering, but specifically stormwater. And our goal was to develop a strategy and actionable plan to begin addressing decade-long problems. Tonight, let me walk you through what we're going to do tonight. We're going to provide updates on how we arrived at today from a policy perspective. We're going to give you an update, as I mentioned. I think to help put all this in context, we want to tell you what we're doing as a city, citywide, not just in your neighborhood. But most importantly, we want to share the efforts so far in your neighborhood and the initial plan for what we call the Walnut North Drainage Basin. That's just a term that we've used from a staff perspective and with our engineers to basically describe the drainage path that originates in the cemetery and runs due south through private and public properties down to Walnut Avenue via Ridge Street, McFarland Avenue, Franklin Street, West Franklin Street, and then Valley Drive ultimately to McCarty subdivision. Couple of housekeeping items, and then I'll introduce our speakers. The restrooms are located just outside in the foyer on the right. We do have a sign-in sheet, so I think we have most of your mailing addresses, but if you're comfortable and would sign that, it would be helpful to us so that we know who's here, your addresses, and your contact number. And then what we would ask, we're going to cover a lot of material, so we would ask that you save questions at the end. We'll be here as long as the group would like, but to keep us on track, I would ask that you hold your questions until the end. And if you have a very specific question that relates to your property or maybe just you and your neighbors that doesn't pertain to the overall drainage basin, feel free to just stay back after the meeting, and then we'll get you connected with the Arcadis team. And if we need to, we can pull your property up in the drainage model and answer whatever very specific questions you may have. And again, since this is such a complex topic, I would say if there may be a question we can't answer tonight, but I assure you we're going to take note of that and we'll respond to you to get you the answer if it's not something that we can answer specifically tonight. The purpose of tonight is, again, to share our plan for the basin and then get your feedback. We need to know, based on the model, the efforts that we've done so far to survey the basin, the assumptions that have been made to develop this model are correct. So if you see something that you don't think is right, please let us know that. And we're willing to look at any adjustments to the plan we need to, but it's got to make sense as it relates to this drainage model that they'll describe to you in just a second. So with that, I'd like to introduce the project team that's been working on the Walnut North Drainage Basin study. As I said, Andrew Parker, that's me, city administrator, former public works director. We do have our Chad, our new public works director that has now been with us for a couple of weeks. Chad brings over a dozen years of experience in the contracting private sector side of the business, and we're very excited to bring him on board. Jackson Shepard is the city stormwater guru, and he's in the public works department and is serving as sort of the project manager for this effort. And then on the Arcadis side, Richard Gruel. Rich, if you don't care to raise your hand, he is our primary point of contact with Arcadis. Rich is a renowned expert in Georgia related to the stormwater field. He's helped a lot of cities develop their plans, including Dalton in 2006 with a different firm. He's worked with GDOT and a lot of other folks and brings a lot of very good information as it relates to this field specific to Georgia. Alex Carlson. Alex, if you don't care to stand up. Alex was one of the primary modelers for this project. Alex is probably one of the most experts in this field on the Eastern Seaboard. He actually flew in from Virginia Beach, and he's been to Dalton now 2 or 3 times specific to this project and others. And then we thought it was important to have him here tonight. Taylor Tittle is on the design side out of the Chattanooga office, and he's been assisting on phases of this project and other projects that we have ongoing. Madison Smith, if you don't care to raise your hand. Madison's also out of the Chattanooga office helping us on design. A couple of other folks that aren't here that have assisted on this project are Chris Solden out of Richmond, Virginia, and Mike Devano, who I think some of you have met. He's from Philadelphia, and He's been guiding us in our stormwater planning strategy and working on some of the biggest cities in the United States. I think Washington, D.C. and New York City with their urban stormwater challenges. So we definitely think that if they can help them, they can help Dalton, Georgia. So at this time, what I'd like to do is turn it over to Rich. And then as we go through the evening, we'll have different speakers. And again, we'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, y'all. It's great to be back. I'm going to take a few slides here and just kind of go over the program and kind of help you kind of walk you guys through how we went from, y'all been talking about this for a long time to now we're actually, doing some real hard engineering planning and whatnot. Okay. Is that better? Can y'all hear me? Okay. Talk to you about the overall program, about how we got here, where we're actually doing some hard engineering, some actual planning for construction. So EOS update. I realize that probably means absolutely nothing to y'all. EOS stands for extent of service. The best way to describe that is it's what infrastructure is the city responsible for? Where do they do their work? Historically, EOS policies in communities all over Georgia and Dalton, they've only looked at infrastructure on public property. So like, City Hall, all the drains outside. And then they've looked at public rights of way. In other words, the public streets. That's historically where most public works have focused their efforts. In January of last year, so just 13 months ago, the city updated their EOS policy for where they're going to do work. And while it in broad strokes is very similar to the EOS policy of the city, they added a caveat on the backside of it. And they looked at a policy of where the public will take on additional responsibility for infrastructure. In other words, where will taxpayers pay to upgrade stormwater infrastructure off of public right-of-way or public property. And so they developed this process that they go through to determine where it is that that they should spend your money. So where they will take that on is there's three things they look at before they will consider taking on a drainage system. The first is the system connected directly to the existing public system? So in your mind for a second, just kind of envision this. You got a road, it's got a couple of inlets on the road, and there's a pipe connecting the two inlets, and then there's a pipe that goes off and then discharges, dumps the water into a ditch somewhere off of the right of way. And let's say you live in that house. Historically, at the right of way line, the rest of the pipe would become your problem. But that doesn't really seem fair because it's collecting, all the water that's coming into that system is from the road, goes off the system. So what they're doing now is they're saying, look, if it's connected directly to a public right-of-way drainage system, we'll consider taking that on. Another scenario that we discussed was if there is a significant amount of stormwater runoff conveyed by a drainage system and it's generated by city-owned property or city right-of-way. So let's say you own the property right over here, right next to City Hall. All the water that goes into your drainage system on your property comes from City Hall. That would be a significant amount of public water that's going on there. If that's negatively impacting your drainage system, then that would make sense to take on that drainage system for maintenance. And then the final scenario is they'll look at if the failure of the drainage system will result in a significant threat to the public and or adjacent property. In other words, let's say we got a flooding situation where it's going to cause loss of life or loss of access for emergency services or something along those lines. That's the third scenario where the city would say, okay, let's go look at that and see if that makes sense for taxpayer money to go onto that private property. So let's say we got in a situation, which in the Walnut North Basin, we have that situation. The city may accept the drainage system for operation, maintenance, and improvement as long as it meets a couple of criteria. First, the drainage system can't be damaged due to negligence. So let's say your neighbors got one of those systems and they decided to do some improvements and they crushed the pipe. Well, it doesn't really seem fair for the rest of the taxpayers to have to take on that burden because of something that a property owner did intentionally, not intentionally, but directly impacted that pipe system. Then that's a little, that kind of factors into that decision matrix of whether they're going to take on that property or on that infrastructure. And then The other condition is they need to have an easement. And an easement is just simply a written agreement between the property owner and the city that says, here's where the city can work, here's what they can do, here's their responsibilities, so that they're not running all over your yard. You know, it just kind of contains that area where they're responsible and where they're not. All right. There are a few situations where the city and the taxpayers will not take on infrastructure. First one is non-residential property, commercial industrial properties. They're not going to take on Walmart's drainage system. Walmart's got plenty of money. They can pay for their own drainage. So that's a scenario where the city's not going to take that on. And then the other one is if a drainage system is located under an existing building. In other words, somebody built a house, just from a liability standpoint, it's really tough to work on those without causing damage. And so they decided that, you know, this is not one of those scenarios where they really want to get in the middle of. So if it's going under a home, you can really screw the home up just touching. So let's say we haven't met those criteria. We've got some. So prior to the acceptance of a drainage easement, in other words, they say, okay, we think this is our responsibility. Public should pay for it. You guys are going to grant an easement, you know, if it's on your property. Then here's how the process would go. Before the easement has to be accepted by the city council. This is not something that Andrew can sign off unilaterally on, or Chad could sign off on. It's got to go to the council. The public officials have to vote on this. The easement would be prepared, and but before they do that, there's going to be a corrective action plan. And so for those of you who may remember, Jackson here gave a discussion not too long ago. So, he gave a discussion about the corrective action plan, I believe, for this basin. And so he prepared this discussion so that the city council was informed about what potentially could go into this solution, so they can understand the risks and the potential costs to the taxpayers. Following the acceptance of the easement by the council, the corrective action plan, it would go into a list of capital projects, and I'll talk about those in just a minute, but it's going to go into a list of projects for programming. And at that point, you've got a real project. But what it will not do is go to the very top automatically. So let's say you guys have been waiting for years for a project, and then somebody else gets an easement on the other side of town. Their project's not going to jump yours just because they got a project accepted. So there is a process that's going on, and for prioritization. So that's EOS in a nutshell. And I just want to help you guys understand how we got to this place, because some of the infrastructure in the Walnut North Basin meets these criteria. And so that's why, we're talking about this today. As part of the city's effort, they've also been cataloging all the known projects, that known stormwater needs. To date, we've identified over 40 different needs in the city related just to drainage. Examples, we got flooding of homes, we got flooding of buildings, we've got streams that are degrading and threatening public and threatening property. As the streams get washed out, they get wider, they potentially could impact homes and other property. We got failing infrastructure. Jackson, do you remember how many tier 1A metal pipes do we have in the city? Wasn't it like? Yeah, we got 3,000 linear feet. Tier 1A pipe is a pipe that's under a road that if it fails, that road is cut off. People can't get in, emergency services can't get in, the residents are completely blocked off. So these are critical pipes that are metal, that are rusting, and Jackson went out and looked at a whole lot of pipes, and that is being programmed in potentially for lining at some point down the road. So they're tracking that. They've got stormwater management infrastructure. We're trying to figure out ways to get the flows down in some of the cities, like think Mcclellan Creek. For those of you who heard that stream before, that's an example of where we're trying to do some infrastructure to help reduce the flow rates, to reduce flooding. So all these projects get put into a list, and then they're going to be prioritized, and the prioritization factors are being considered. It's like, how critical is the infrastructure? So like that pipe under that road, they can't get in or out, or what's the status? Is it public? Is it private? Should it be public? And then flooding severity, is a problem that's causing floodwaters to go into somebody's home, or is it nuisance flooding, or is it erosion issues? What's the criticality and the severity of the problem? All those are going to be put into a decision matrix that's currently being developed to help kind of identify, all right, we need to do this project, and this project. these projects, you know, we don't want to say, sorry, your house has to keep flooding because we did some lower priority project first. So we're trying to be smart about how we're spending the money. So I just wanted to kind of lay out that and understand, you know, how the city's making decisions on these projects. We do have some projects, and I think Jackson, why don't you go ahead and come on up. Talk about some of the successes and some of the current efforts. Obviously, the last bullet there, you guys will probably recognize in this meeting, but Jackson, why don't you go through this? And then after Jackson talks, Alex is going to come up. He was the principal modeling engineer on y'all's project, and he's going to walk you through everything that we looked at as part of this solution and then what the recommendations are moving forward. Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, Rich. Good evening, everyone, and want to thank everybody for coming out to understand the efforts that the city is has going on with our stormwater efforts. And I'm going to go ahead and give you a brief overview of the current projects we have going on in the city, as well as the recently completed projects. Starting with Covey Ridge. This is a particular location residing within the Mill Creek watershed where there were significant residential flooding hazards. And what the city has done is come and has acquired undeveloped property and has developed a detention pond upstream from these sensitive areas in the residential area, and in the means to attenuate the flow and provide and to mitigate the flooding hazards within this drainage basin. Second one that was completed recently was the Brookwood flood storage project. This is a particular location where once again, you had residential structural hazards that were caused by due to the geographical location of this drainage basin. And what we have done is we have under voluntary participation, the property owner of the city acquired his property and removed the impervious surface, displacing water within the floodplain and providing a flood storage area to help as a staging point for peak flow events before it reaches Tar Creek. This particular location is a prime example of a floodplain restoration project, since this particular property was located directly within a floodplain. Now we'll move on to the projects that are in the design phase. Starting with Crater Alley, this is a particular location where there's been multiple reports of flooding concerns as far as structural flooding and as well as street flooding. And what we are working currently with Arcadis to design is a underground detention system upstream from these locations of vulnerable locations in the hopes to attenuate the flow as well as to mitigate the flooding concerns downstream from this drainage basin. Next we go to is the Glenwood Avenue flood mitigation project. This is another situation where you have a structural flooding concern where a structure is frequently becoming inundated with floodwaters and as well as street flooding. This particular location, we're working with Arcadis to develop a infrastructure that will be able to take the amount of conveyance runoff from these drainage basins. Next is Mcclellan Creek Drainage Basin Evaluation, and this is part of a larger scale work that Arcadis is currently working on as part of the flood abatement plan, where they're going to be evaluating the entire drainage basin and be able to pinpoint where the best places to implement stormwater attenuation strategies to provide the best flow attenuation and strategize from that point. And this visual you see here is a location where due to the tributary stream where the tributary stream comes in and enters Mcclellan Creek. This area is prone to flooding, and we have submitted an ARPA grant, which I'll get to in a minute, for this project similar to the Brookwood project, where it's a floodplain restoration project where we're removing the impervious surface as well as looking at implementing a retention reservoir on the site. Now we get to funding. The city has been working with Arcadis, a team from Arcadis who specializes in grant funding. And one that we've recently have completed applications for is the American Rescue Plan Act. This is a plan or a funding grant that provides infrastructure improvement funding for, in particular for stormwater. And so we were able to work with their team and develop applications for a few of the projects that was mentioned previously. Crater Alley for the underground detention storage, Glenwood Avenue for the conveyance infrastructure improvements, and McClellan Creek for that particular property as within the floodplain rehabilitation. And lastly is a project for critical infrastructure where due to location and its alignment with structures, it's deemed necessary to be proactive and move forward with implementations to repair the existing failing infrastructure. Now we'll move on to the Walnut North Drainage Basin. So this particular location, which the city is already committed to implementing the drainage improvements within the West Hill Cemetery. This is unique where this is a large drainage basin prior to entering residential areas where water is conveying through city property. And so what we're looking to do is going to do everything we can to improve that on our side on city property as a start. So in summary, just want to give you a brief, a general picture idea that this is a citywide effort. There are multiple locations with flooding hazards, with structures that are in danger of flooding. And this is the reason why Walnut North is also on this list, is because of that issue and the sensitivity of that area. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Alex.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming and learn more about the basin. Looking forward to getting into some more of the details about the analysis in Walnut North and discussing some of our results and scenarios. So first, I want to kind of take a step back and look at this Walnut North Basin and look at it from a bird's eye view and what all goes into this drainage study. So what we did was compile a bunch of different data, survey, city records, historic rainfall data, historic flood records, and we start piecing all this together. And we look at building a computer model of the entire watershed. And you'll note that this watershed is over 200 acres that just drain down to Walnut Avenue. So we're talking serious contributing drainage areas, particularly over 50 acres that drain down from West Hill Cemetery into the residential community. So these are the kind of things we start looking at a very bird's eye view and then are able to drill down into more details. So I'm going to briefly touch on the main objectives of the study and what went into it in terms of parameters, and then ultimately our goals. So we wanted to understand in detail the drainage system, as I mentioned, from the top of the watershed, which starts at West Hill Cemetery, and then model that down to Walnut Avenue to see the performance of the existing system. We wanted to use a computer model to do that so we can test different scenarios within the basin. Our main goals are to look at reducing structural flooding. As Rich mentioned that is a high priority where we have stormwater around and in structures. We wanted to find ways that we could more efficiently manage the infrastructure and manage the runoff. And we also wanted to extend the infrastructure's life expectancy, since this is infrastructure that's put in the ground, has to be maintained long-term. So some of our primary parameters that constrain this study, we wanted to look at solutions that were not going to transfer problems downstream. So that's a main benefit of doing a watershed study like this, is we can look at it, what's going on at the top of the basin and what's going down in the bottom of the basin, and make sure we're not transferring one problem on one street to the next street down. We wanted to work within the current EOS policy that Rich discussed, and we wanted to look where we can achieve a 100-year storm solution for areas of structural flooding. And I'll hit on when I talk a lot about 100-year storms or different year storms. I'll get into detail on that. So we'll talk a lot about a 1-year storm, a 10-year storm, a 100-year storm. What does that mean? So a storm frequency is its probability to occur at a given time. So it's not necessarily that a 100-year storm will only occur once in 100 years. It could happen in back-to-back years. It's strictly a statistical probability of that storm. And the way we define that is for design and analysis is how much rain is probable on a given day during a 24-hour period and the rainfall depth. So here I have just a general table showing storm frequencies from 1 to 100, and with a 1-year storm being about 3 inches of rain during a 24-hour period. So again, has a higher probability, and 3 inches of rain is a thunderstorm that can happen pretty frequently. Whereas a 100-year storm is almost 8 inches of rain in a day. So that's going to be a bigger event, a more severe event, possibly some sort of tropical system or something like that. And a lot of times you'll hear a 100-year storm. That's what FEMA floodplains and those type of mapping efforts are looking at, the 100-year storm. Another thing to note, as we were doing this study, we had a couple different historical events that were recent that we were able to test and model and get rainfall data for. One was in April of 2020, which was approximately 6 inches of rain in 24 hours. So that would equate out to a 25-year storm. So about between a 1-year and a 100-year. That's a significant amount of rainfall. And then we also had in March of 2021, we had almost 4 inches of rain. So again, that's around almost like a 2-year storm event. So I'll talk about storm events, and that's what it relates to, is the amount of rainfall during a day. The other term that we might use when we're describing drainage systems is level of service, LOS. So that is the storm system's capacity, whether that's a pipe, a channel. That is the storm that it can convey without flooding occurring upstream. So we'll say a channel or pipe has a 10-year level of service. That means that it can pass that 10-year storm without flooding being experienced immediately upstream. So we looked at several different scenarios to improve the drainage conditions in the Walnut North Basin. The first scenario that we wanted to test was primarily focused on the properties along Ridge Street, just south of Emory Street, where there's existing infrastructure in residential backyards, and there's documented flooding in those properties. So we wanted to test the scenario and say, okay, if we came in and just upsize those pipes, right? Bigger pipes, let's let the flow go and improve the capacity of the system. We want to see what that would do. And with our goal, again, to try to limit the structural flooding, reduce the structural flooding during a 100-year storm event. So this would include replacing pipes from West Emory Street down to the end of Ridge Street in the existing backyards. These tables might be a little hard to see here. I can just verbally talk through them, but what we saw was that we could achieve a 100-year level of service for those properties, but we would be increasing flows downstream. And like I mentioned, we're really looking to not transfer problems downstream in the basin. So what I have here is this table shows values of peak flows, which we use. It's a measurement of how much runoff is coming through the system and the rate of runoff. And we can see that several of these numbers are red. And what that is indicating us in the table and the model output is that flow is increasing downstream. So again, a big factor in this is not transferring problems. We do see that for the properties along Ridge Street, we were able to achieve a 100-year level of service, a huge increase from the current 1 to 5-year level of service. But we wanted to test some other scenarios as well and see how we could address some of these peak flow increases that we were seeing downstream. And again, just in summary, this is what we call our scenario A, which was the capacity improvements along Ridge Street. And some of the advantages, as I mentioned, it achieves a 100-year level of service in the Ridge Street, the properties along Ridge Street, and reduces the flooding there. But some of the challenges would be significant work on private property. So these would be large pipes on private property, having to work around existing structures, the long-term maintenance of those pipes on private property with challenging access conditions. And again, as I mentioned, the transferring of flooding and problems downstream from this scenario. So the next scenario that we looked at, we call scenario B, and this is an alternative to say, okay, instead of taking the existing pipes, I'm going to bring up a laser pointer here so I can show. So this is Ridge Street, West Emory. So instead of taking the existing pipes in the backyards on Ridge Street and upsizing them in place, we said, okay, what if we intercepted the drainage, the 50+ acres of drainage coming down from the cemetery, and diverted it along Emory Street and then down Ridge Street in the roadway. There's existing roadway and right of way there. That way we're taking that flow off of that existing backyard system. We saw similar levels of flood reduction as the scenario A that I previously discussed. We could achieve a 100-year level of service for the properties along Ridge Street. But as I mentioned before, we're still seeing these red numbers in the model printouts, which is indicating that flow is being increased downstream. So again, the advantages of scenario B, simply bypassing the flow down Ridge Street, we can provide that 100-year level of service and reduce flooding. And most of the work would be in public right of way because the new system would run along Emory Street and then down Ridge Street. But the main challenge was it could still transfer problems downstream. So this is where scenario C is where we started getting out of just typical pipe and conveyance improvements. We started to see, okay, we know we have a lot of water coming down into this area. What can we do to more efficiently and better manage this water before it gets to some of these problem spots? So in scenario C, we went up and did a survey and detailed investigations up in the cemetery just to see how much water is coming down and where could we add some more storage. And you'll hear detention storage. And all that is just room for water to be stored during rainfall events, and then it can be slowly released instead of coming in on an onrush during like a flash flood situation. So we wanted to look and see where could we provide some more storage to let water be stored in the cemetery and be slowly released downstream. And what we came up with was a few locations where there's actually some existing basins in the cemetery, just north of West Emory Street in the blue, that could be expanded. And then this green area further to the north is an existing ditch. And I'll get into details about this project in a bit, but that's actually going to be a series of what we call regenerative stormwater conveyances, which help slow the water down before it gets further in the watershed. So we found that with this scenario alone of just adding in storage up in the cemetery, we could actually improve the performance and the level of service of the drainage infrastructure along Ridge Street, Mcclellan Avenue, and even down into West Franklin Avenue, or sorry, West Franklin. So it would not achieve the same performance level and level of service as the pipe capacities I was mentioning in scenarios A and B, but we could still take the level of service up from and around existing 1 to 2 year level of service, as I mentioned before, up to a 5 to 10 year level of service. So it is moving the needle to be able to take some of that runoff off the system and slow it down before it gets down to Ridge Street, McFarland, and West Franklin. And the other critical piece to this scenario is that, as you'll see, there's no red numbers here in this table. So not only are we not increasing flows, we're reducing flows. So this gives us some flexibility to look at other improvements in the basin because we're taking more flow off the system. So again, advantages to adding storage up in the cemetery. It provides some level of performance increase to the existing infrastructure that's in the ground today. And most of the work is on public right of way. It's in the cemetery. But the main issue is it's still not providing that significant structural flood protection that we were talking about with the 100-year storm. So that's where we had to get a little more creative and trying to look at how we can piece things together. So the next scenario that we analyzed was taking the West Hill Cemetery storage and then combining that with the scenario B, the Ridge Street bypass system, the pipe along Emery Street and Ridge Street, and combine those together to see how they would perform. And what we found was that we could provide a 100-year level of service for the structures and properties on Ridge Street with this combination. We could still slightly improve some of the drainage conditions on Mcclellan and West Franklin by increasing the level of performance of those systems slightly. And most importantly, we would also not be transferring the problem downstream. So these two projects, these two scenarios are kind of working hand in hand. One is allowing the system to be improved in its capacity performance, and the other is slowing down the runoff so that the problem is not transferred downstream. So the scenario D advantages we're addressing the flooding adjacent to Ridge Street. We're not transferring that problem, and we're providing some slight increase in performance of the downstream structures, and most importantly, the work is in the public right of way. Now, the other main thing that we noticed and the challenge that we noticed with this was that it's still not providing significant structural relief for flooding downstream of Ridge Street. So McFarland Avenue and West Franklin Street are not getting up to the 100-year level of service that we mentioned before. So this is where we add on one more portion of the improvement that is downstream of Ridge Street and would start along the western edge of West Franklin Street, and would include pipe capacity improvements along West Franklin down to Valley. And this would work in conjunction with the other scenarios that I mentioned, scenario D, to provide increases in level of performance for properties along West Franklin and McFarland and Valley. So with this scenario E, we're able to achieve a 100-year level of service along Ridge Street at McFarland, along West Franklin, the western edge of West Franklin, and then increase the level of performance to a 50-year at Miller Street and West Franklin, and to a 25 to a 10-year down at Valley and Walnut. So this is able to move it up into that target level of performance that we were looking to achieve, 100-year for the structural flooding, while also, as you'll note, there's no red numbers here indicating a transfer of the problem downstream. So as I mentioned, we're addressing flooding along Ridge Street. We're addressing flooding along West Franklin, McFarland, and on Valley as well. And it has advantages that most of the work is in the public right of way. We're not transferring the problem downstream. And the most significant challenge here is just that this is a significant investment. This is a lot of infrastructure, hundreds of feet of pipe, detention storage in the cemetery. This is a big investment in the stormwater system in this area of the basin. So as I mentioned, I'll go into more detail specifically on scenario C, which is now the West Hill Cemetery improvements. So this project primarily details the conversion of an existing stone line ditch that runs through the northern part of the cemetery. That's going to be converted to, as I mentioned, a regenerative stormwater conveyance. RSC is what we call them. It'll include the expansion of an existing basin and ditches to provide more flood storage. The installation of outlet control structures. So what these structures are they're finally designed and modeled to actually control the flow rates coming out of these elements. So we can design them to best suit the location. These improvements would also work in conjunction with the downstream lining of existing metal pipes. So when we talk about lining, typically there's a couple different methods, but plastic, concrete liners, there's several different technologies, but what these can do is they can help support a failing pipe structurally, but they also increase the performance of the pipe because compared to a metal pipe, which you'll see has ridges, the liners are typically the plastic in nature and they're smoother. So the water can actually more efficiently go through that pipe. And the overall goal of this project, the West Hill Cemetery Improvements Design, is to slow and detain stormwater flows from the 50+ acre drainage basin in the West Hill Cemetery. So as I mentioned, the regenerative stormwater conveyance on the right here is the existing stone line ditch in the cemetery, which is conveying drainage from the uphill reaches of the cemetery. And what an RSC, regenerative stormwater conveyance, does, its main goal, is to provide attenuation, to slow down that water by the building of these boulder step pools. And these are built in the existing channel and they help trap water, allow it to slowly infiltrate and be absorbed by the ground, some of it to be evaporated. And they slow down that water that's currently just ripping down the ditch. And along with that, they do provide some storage in the pool itself. And these are really great projects. We've done several in the Mid-Atlantic area, and they're growing in popularity because a lot of times there's also erosion issues in these areas, and this type of solution can also address erosion as well as water quality. So the water is actually being treated as it's going through these pools, and it can provide habitat for different birds and things like that. So they're definitely growing in popularity. The other aspect of the West Hill Cemetery design is the expansion of the existing basins that are out there. As y'all have probably seen, these depressional areas are currently functioning as a stormwater basin in their current capacity, and we would look to improve that by slightly digging them out and digging them deeper. But the main thing is we want to be very careful, since we are working in a cemetery. We went out and got lots of survey data, actually did ground penetrating radar to detect if there was any graves or any unknown things underneath the ground that we would be digging around. So we want to be very cognizant of that as we were putting together these designs. So the overall benefits of what this West Hill Cemetery project is going to bring to the table: reduction in peak flows from the current rates being released downstream in the basin, the increase in level of service for the downstream pipes and infrastructure. A few of note here along at 612 Ridge Street, where there's current flooding, it has less than a 1-year level of service. So that 3 inches of rain is enough to cause flooding the ground, the water to come out of the system there. That would be increased to a 10-year by adding this detention and cemetery improvements. 622 Mcclellan, again, a 1-year level of service would be increased to a 2-year. But the critical thing is this is the first step in reducing flows to allow more downstream storm pipe improvements and capacity improvements to be undertaken without increasing downstream flows and transferring problems in the basin. And I try not to get too in the weeds on some of these printouts. Actually, it's really hard to see on some of these colors here. But what I have here is a graph of the inflow rates. This one is particularly at 612 Ridge, as I mentioned, has a current 1-year level of service. we graph the rates of inflow coming from upstream areas, in this case from the cemetery and coming down underneath West Emory Street. And the existing graph, this is the 10-year storm, so about five plus inches of rain in 24 hours. The existing rate is being almost cut in half by the cemetery detention improvements. And we tested and tried many different configurations of this design to see which one was going to be optimal given the characteristics of the watershed. And what we found was that at first we were looking at conveying some of the additional drainage along West Emory Street also into the basin. And what we found was that actually with this location at the cemetery, conveying the drainage from West Emory Street into that basin would actually increase rates downstream. And the main reason why is that as that basin fills up early in a storm from the drainage from the street, it's getting very quickly, since it's all piped and it's curb and gutter, it's going to get into the basin very quickly. But then there's a larger flow of water coming down from the 50 acres upstream in the cemetery. And when that gets into the basin and there's already water from the street in the basin being controlled, it stacks up on each other, and it actually will release more water out of the basin downstream towards Ridge Street and McFarland and West Franklin. So these graphs here, the two in particular, and again, I apologize, this is difficult to see on the screen, but there's a graph here, and this peak here is actually the release rate out of the basin if we were to direct that West Emory Street drainage into that basin. First, if we actually let the West Emory Street drainage go first, kind of get out of our way early on in the storm, and then you can see this little hump here. This is actually the runoff coming down from the cemetery, and it's greatly controlled by the basin. So the idea here is you want to separate these two peaks of flow. You don't want them to stack up on each other. What happens when we direct that drainage is the rates of flow actually stack up and they create a larger peak. And again, I can show some of these on the screen. They might show up better, not the projection screen. Similarly, we looked at larger storms, such as the 50 and 100 year. And again, we saw that the performance of the basin with taking just the cemetery drainage was greater than diverting both the cemetery and West Emory Street drainage into it. And again, this is because that effect that the basin will fill up earlier in the storm and not be able to provide storage for the larger volume and rate coming down from the cemetery during a large storm. The other things that we looked at in great detail were the performance of the system improvements up at the cemetery on some of the existing infrastructure. A particular note was there's an existing open channel drainage ditch behind 622 and 620 McFarland. That ditch currently is conveying runoff from this location in the watershed and running it down to West Franklin. So we wanted to look in great detail of what these improvements would do to the performance of that open channel. And we can actually see that with the detention up in the cemetery, rates would be decreased significantly from existing conditions. So that was definitely a bonus of adding this detention upstream. And in particular on this ditch even more, looking at the full scenario E, which I mentioned combines the detention in the cemetery, the bypass of stormwater flows on Ridge Street, and then the downstream improvements on West Franklin, we found that flow depths in this ditch during the 10-year storm, again, about 5 inches of rain during a day, significant storm event, flow depths in that existing channel could be reduced by 1 foot by these improvements. So even though necessarily nothing is being proposed with this channel, the improvements upstream and downstream all work together to help the whole system perform better. And just to hit in a little bit more detail on the future efforts, as I mentioned, West Hill is kind of like a first step to allow us to open up to more downstream improvements. The Ridge Street bypass would pick up drainage coming from the cemetery in West Emery Street, direct it down to the east on West Emery and turn down Ridge Street. That'd be approximately a 48-inch diameter storm drain, so a pretty decent sized storm drain that would be underneath the roadway. And that would convey a majority of the upstream flow coming from the cemetery and roadway. Provide a 100-year level of service for the properties along Ridge Street. And there would actually be a diversion plate. We can put these into drainage structures to kind of cause the flow to turn and go in a different direction. And what that would allow us to do is divert that flow down Ridge Street and around the existing flooding problem now. The other downstream improvement would be the West Franklin Street system improvements. So currently there's a drainage line going down West Franklin. It kind of snakes back and forth from the north side to the south side, and then eventually goes down to an open channel behind the properties on Valley. But what we would plan to do is pick up the open channel that runs currently down behind the properties on McFarland. We'd improve the existing culvert entrance that is currently now a 36-inch culvert. That would be upsized to a larger box that would be more efficient to get that water into the system. And then a parallel storm pipe would be added along West Franklin. That would be put in parallel with the existing to more than double the capacity of the existing system that's currently on West Franklin. And that would provide 100-year level of service for the properties on McFarland and a 50-year level of service for flows in the street down West Franklin. And lastly, Valley Drive system improvements. So this is kind of the last downstream leg of this plan here. It'd include a 42-inch storm pipe that would connect at West Franklin and Valley and would convey flows south on Valley and then return those flows to the existing open channel behind the properties on Valley. And this would provide a 25-year level of service for the properties on Valley Drive, which are currently at a 2-year or less level of service, and would also help stabilize the existing channel behind the properties on Valley. So with that, that's what we had in the presentation. As Andrew mentioned, we'll open up for some questions.
Okay, so I know that was a lot of material. Thank you for staying with us for the full presentation. We'll move the mic around the room to give you an opportunity to ask questions about the plan and the study. And again, as I said, if you want to get into the very specifics, we're very glad to do so. It may just be easier to do that more on a one-on-one setting with Alex on his computer or whatever. But if there are any general questions, we'll go ahead and just go around the room. And just please state your location so that they'll know. Okay, okay.
My name's Bruce Jennings. Before I retired, I was an architect. I just realized that this is the first time I've ever spoken in a building I designed. So you guys did a great job on this, but I'm the guy down at the butt end. I'm at 707 Valley Drive. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you. I live at 707 Valley Drive. There is a ditch from 705 Valley Drive that runs to Walnut Avenue. There was a culvert that was under 705 Valley Drive, which is now approximately 150 feet down the creek. I'm gonna grab, I'll go through these very quickly. I'm gonna hand you some photographs. First one you see is the ditch behind my house. When I moved in, I put a chain link fence along the edge of the creek, about 2 feet off the creek. And about 10 or 12 years ago, 160 feet of it ended up in the creek. Got most of it out, had to replace the fence. During that time, the area from 705 Valley Drive down to Walnut Avenue has continued to erode. And I'm not going to go through all these photographs with you, but if you look, you will see that there are, and I pulled out about 4 or 5 examples, trees where you can stand in the creek and look at the underside of the tree and the root system. Have identified at least 5 trees that if they fall will hit a house. And it is my understanding that that is going to be rip-wrapped. It would also be a great place to put a series of the rip-wrap diverters to kind of build that water up a little bit. My primary concern is that all the way from 705 Valley Drive and 707 Valley Drive, where my good neighbor Jack lives, he lives 705, from there down to Walnut Avenue, just about anything within, say, 7 or 8 feet of the water in a ditch, the roots are showing on the trees. And some of these trees are over 200 feet tall. There is one that has fallen, but was caught by other trees. Now, I built an addition on the back of my house, and you'll see one tree in there that looks perfectly normal until you look at the next 2 photographs and see the erosion out from underneath. You'll see a tree, a pecan tree that is next to a chain link fence. And then if you look at the photograph after that, you'll see that you can count all the roots on the bottom of the tree. And that tree has already started leaning toward my new addition. I also invested about $30,000 in building a golf garden. I'm an avid golfer. Built a putting green, I built a ball striking area. And there are 3 or 4 trees that they're all on the east side of the creek. I live on the west side, and there are at least 3 trees there that they could give away tonight. So I guess my question is that everything you did up here is beautiful, but there are some pending problems, particularly from Franklin Street over to Walnut Avenue, that could cause structural damage to a number of high-priced homes, mine being included in that. So I would like to ask you guys to take a look at that. If you decide to walk it, please wear snake leggings, as I killed 3 copperheads when I walked it. And I would just like to ask you guys to take a look at that and see if nothing else, if at least the trees that are being uprooted are the main problem. If that ditch could be cleaned out where the water would flow a little bit better, if the trees could be cut down that had been undermined, that would take care of the immediate problems that we're going to face. I mean, somebody's house is going to get mashed in the next 2 years, and it's not going to be minor. I did a little calibration of the tree I'm most concerned about. It's on the west side. Even though it's growing straight up, there's nothing under it. And if it falls, it would take out my new addition and my existing home. And we've already had this, we call it Smith residence. It's Plymouth Smith's granddaughter that lives there, her and her wonderful husband, Jack, and 2 kids. That house got hit by a tree when we had that windstorm about 5 years ago. And another windstorm like that, I think it was a downburst is what they call it. It wasn't a tornado. It uprooted a 24-inch pecan tree in my backyard, tore it out by its roots, and moved the base of the tree 15 feet as it fell. So it's a pretty dangerous situation. Now, I have two questions for you that I'd like for you to consider. That drainage area you showed me, you've got more accurate data than I do, but I have driven the kind of the top line of all of that drainage area. And for my calculations, that's somewhere around 2.2 to 2.4 square miles of drainage area. Your numbers are better than mine, but that's a significant area. Every bit of water from that is going to converge at a 90-degree angle at an already failed culvert that you plan to replace at 405 and 407 Valley Drive. Now, I also noticed that you have a water flow conduit that will have to come across my property. I'm gonna work. I want the drainage to work. One thing you need to consider about that pipe is that from the street level of Valley Drive, you go about 120 feet and it drops around 18 or 19 feet as well as I can tell. That water, excuse my French, can be hauling ass when it hits that stream, and it's going to be hitting it at a 90-degree angle. And it's going to be combining at that point with all of the drainage water coming from down Valley Drive, across the front yards. I think there's a spring up there close to the Baptist church. And in that ditch, I've already lost about 4 to 6 feet of property. Unfortunately, my deed said my property ran to the top of that ditch. Top of that ditch is 6 feet closer to my house than it used to be in some places. And to close, I'm sorry if I took up too much time, but to close, if anybody likes whitewater rafting and we get enough rain tonight, just come on over to my house and we'll raft the creek behind my house. Thank you very much. Good job, guys. I'm just hoping that maybe somehow or another the city can get in and at least get the danger from 405, 407 Valley Drive intersection down to Walnut Avenue, at least get that creek cleaned out so the water will flow and get the trees that have been undermined out of there. And that's my primary request tonight. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Jennings. And I will say, I applaud the council in 13 months ago for giving us the tools to be able to engage with you to get easements that we need. So I think in that particular scenario, that's certainly a candidate if we go ahead and get the easements to enter early. And then I wanted to let maybe Alex or Rich address the question about the pipe coming in at 90 degrees, what or even Taylor from a design perspective, how we would try to keep that from, being an issue.
If I might add one thing, the only way to get riprap to that ditch is to start at Walnut Avenue and cut down trees and build a road, or come across my property and do the riprap of the ditch. Those trucks are going to be heavy. So before you can run the culvert from Valley Drive down to the creek, you're going to have to bring the riprap in first, because those riprap trucks will crush the pipe that you would be putting in. And I hope there'll be some kind of baffle system in that pipe to slow that water down.
Thank you. Alex, do you want to touch on that?
So the extent of our study definitely covered, your location, and we're looking at flows, and we're looking at the stormwater model in that area. I think the biggest thing with that system would obviously be some sort of energy dissipation, which is used to help slow the velocities of the water down as it's coming out into the channel. Also, as structural stream bank kind of stabilization. We specifically looked at the culvert in detail at 705 as well, as part of the study, and as a candidate for whether it's lining or something of that nature. So all things that we're taking into account as we're looking at this drainage model. And yeah, I've been out to 705 and I've seen that culvert as well. So thank you for providing this detail for this area. And yeah, it would definitely look at this area in great detail.
Thank you. Other question?
Hey, good evening. I'm Steve Snyder, my wife Kathy at 612 Ridge Street. That's been on the screen. I appreciate the city doing this tonight and Arcadis people being here and the plans and everything. Still two major concerns, and we can talk a little bit more afterwards. But one is, and we discussed when everyone came out, walked our property, looked at everything, was the water from the west that comes off of Greenwood Avenue. And it's significant. And nothing is in here to address that. And we made multiple points about that water that comes down and intersects between 612 and 614 next door to us. That's a huge problem not being addressed. And the other one is that we can go into more detail afterwards is, and you talked about, Alex, was not diverting that water from Emory and north of Ridge. But that's the water that comes to us first. And we sent videos showing that our system is almost at capacity and that water is clear. So that's all that street water. That's not the muddy water coming from the cemetery. That comes later. That's the second half of the flooding. The first part is all the street water that comes off of North Emory Street that comes under the curbs and underground comes to us fast and quick in Ridge Street. That's a huge problem. And right now we're not flooding because we have a pipe that's like Swiss cheese. So it's draining in a couple major holes. If that pipe is fixed right now, I'm worried that with the 10-year, we're still going to flood. If we continue to bring that water that fast to us, that street water, plus the water that comes off of Greenwood that intersects, that hits between the two properties, that's slowing everything and backing everything up too. So again, those are, love the plan, love the idea, love what's going to happen, but those two major concerns really aren't being addressed and feel that they need to be.
Yeah, and I definitely really appreciate all the information, data, videos, and all the cooperation. We've been looking at this in, as you know, in great detail. I think the two biggest things, we want to also mention that with the bypass system, that the street water from Emory Street would get diverted from that system. So it would work in conjunction with the cemetery improvements. So that's another big thing. And then also just looking at the severity of the flows and the rate of flows coming down from Emory Street and the cemetery versus the flows that we're seeing coming from Greenwood. It's the flows coming down from the cemetery are over double. So that's why we're focusing right now on those flows coming from the north first versus the ones coming from Greenwood, which as I mentioned are less than half. So that's where we're kind of looking, prioritizing first, and then also working in conjunction with that bypass system, which will help take some of that roadway drainage around with the bypass. So.
It's going to continue to flood. And then again, I agree. Once the bypass system is great, but once the first phase is done, how long until the bypass system is put in place? How many years of potential additional flooding are we going to have until that bypass is in place?
Yeah, I want to back up and talk about the phasing funding, and then I'll let Alex even kind of convey even further about more on the technical side. Alex went into a lot of detail about the West Hill, the scenario A. I'm sorry, I get them mixed up. Scenario C, right? Scenario C, which includes everything in the cemetery we talked about. Funding has been allocated for that phase of the project, and it's totally, we didn't need any easement to do any of that work. That's why you hear us, and you've read in the news media, we're pursuing that, because I think you had it on one slide that talks about that really tees us up, to use a golfing term, to be able to start to do things down further in the basin. We have to do that first. To talk about the other two phases, phase two, which would be the bypass system, and then phase three beginning at Franklin Street. From a staging standpoint, we've quizzed these guys. I think either could be done first when talking about phase two and phase three. I don't want to get ahead of myself as it relates to the mayor and council, but I've been assured that the funding is going to be there to do this full project as presented in scenario E. We did talk about, and just so from a timing standpoint, I think our plan is we're under design. I think the plans in the cemetery are what, 60–70% complete. The funding is there. As soon as they get the plans done, we're going to let that project to construction, get that first phase underway. That way it can tee us up for the next phases. And we plan to pursue those aggressively from a timing perspective so that we don't miss any time. Because what is so unique about Walnut North is we have the study now. They mentioned the 40 other locations, with the exception of a few of those on that project slide. We don't have the benefit of having this full study completed. So that's a phase that we're still going to have to work on in those other basins. So I'm very proud of the team for being in a position to where we can get this, the engineering phases done. So as we look at different alternatives, like what you're talking about and others, we can plug that into the model and very quickly to understand what it would do, just like the timing effect of dumping the road water into the pond first over, letting it get out before the staging in the pond. I had staff, based on the drainage from the west, take a look. We've been studying. It wasn't reflected in the presentation just because it's been something we've been looking at very recently on Greenwood about, could we redirect that water? Could we, although it is the drainage area is reflected in the plan, we're looking at some different scenarios from a timing standpoint. If that was, rather than conveyed directly to the east like it is now, could we reroute it to the north and from a timing perspective, make it hit? Again, all this, as you heard tonight, is all timing is key in a storm event. So we're going to continue to look at that drainage from the west, and if it could be, if it's physically possible to get that water rerouted and keep it in the right of way so that it's not coming, to the private system in the backyards. So unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of detail about that tonight, but we're still studying that as part of our phase two. On Greenwood, you're talking about, right? That's right.
What comes off Greenwood, I get as much off Greenwood as comes through their pipe. And I've got a 48-inch pipe that it will overflow in. So there's a lot of water coming from the west, as you say. 614 Ridge. That's next door to them, feeding right in. I've got a concrete pit in the yard that collects all this. And it's washed out block. It's, I understand that y'all found construction material in the pipe. Well, that's for the water that's washed away what I had to build to merge the water coming from theirs down, and then that all coming off of Greenwood. And I've got videos that I can show you of the water coming out of that 48-inch pipe at the very full, and it's overflowing. I've actually had it where it won't even fit in that. It's coming from them, flowing over the top of my yard to get to that open ditch that goes behind their house and on down there. It's horrible.
And definitely that's where specifically the West Hill Cemetery, that's going to slow that water that you're seeing coming down through the system from the north. And as Andrew mentioned, we've started looking at that system coming from Greenwood Drive as well. Like I mentioned, it's not the majority of the drainage coming down from the north, but it's definitely something that yeah.
On the end of Ridge Street, where the proposed big 48-inch pipe's going to go, you've got a new dual 36 RCP bypass system planned. What exactly does that do?
So we actually, we're looking at, instead of doing a single pipe there, it would be two pipes next to each other, kind of paralleling each other, just because the grade there, the land really falls off as it goes down. So just
Would that increase the flow of water?
not versus current conditions, no, because
we have property that backs up to the open channel, and my neighbor, and then it hits the flood prone area of on the corner where it reduces into a 36-inch pipe
down on McFarland.
And so are we going to overwhelm that area, the open channel to the enclosed corner?
No, because they're working in tandem with the detention up in the cemetery and then the bypass. So flows are being decreased so it can be more efficiently routed down Ridge Street.
Well, I think you're right. Is when the total project gets finished, then you'll have much greater open underground piping to move the water flow.
Yep.
But until the last phase of this gets completed, you're increasing to the open channel is what it looked like. That you're saying it won't be.
Not versus existing conditions, but the downstream would be improved once the West Franklin system is all put in as well. So, because a lot of the flooding we're seeing in the model right now at 620 and 622 McFarland, it's actually the existing culvert there is causing water to back up. So it's kind of propagating that back up. So once capacity is improved there, it can more efficiently be moved without the backing up.
618, and we have a garage structure that's
Really
closer to that ditch. And that's our concern. Is it going to erode the ditch and affect our garage? And we have pool equipment out there too. Whereas theirs, it goes further, not as close to their houses, where this drainage ditch is closer in for us.
Yeah, that's
And what
definitely
we're concerned.
something that, we can look at. As I mentioned, we're trying to balance the flows and not increase, and push that problem downstream with all these alternatives that we've been looking at. And we, in the full build out of that proposed we're seeing lower water depths for that section of the ditch. So lower flows and lower water depths.
Thank you.
Any other? Okay.
I'm Randy Mayfield, and I reside with my wife Renee at 602 Ridge Street. My wife agreed to come if I wouldn't say a word in here tonight, so I'll stay in trouble. Moved to 600 South Ridge Street on August the 13th, 1957. We were thrilled as boys. My brother and I, because we had, if it rained, sometimes we'd get a little creek there. It was about 2 feet deep, maybe 18 inches across. I could step across it as a child. That portion of creek right now is 6 feet deep, 18 feet wide, this condition that this gentleman mentioned at 707 Valley Drive with the trees, we had the same condition. When you wanted to get down in there, you could look up, see the roots. Neighbor on Greenwood, a very responsible individual, Mr. McIntosh, to keep my neighbor Truett Nimmons and I from having a problem. He took down 7 trees that were over 50 years old because one had fallen. And if one of those 125, 150 feet tall trees had fell and they would go to the east, depending on the wind, then there would be a tragedy. He took care of that. I put in 40 feet of pipe behind our residence, and then I put in another 20 feet of pipe behind my neighbor Nimmons, Truett Leanne Nimmons. I appreciate the city accepting the responsibility of increasing the enormous volume and the tremendous velocity of that raging water that comes through there. I stopped my erosion and I had it engineered. Got in trouble with the city. They came out and approved it because I had my engineer there with me. They said it looks good. Being very cautious not to cause a problem. I had looked at it many times, the 30-inch pipe that had been there since 1950 that my neighbors who now live there have to deal with. At 610 Ridge Street, there's a carriage house behind their home there. And I've watched it grow and grow and grow. I took pictures. I filmed it. I watched the curb and gutter, crying, begging them not to put in the curb and gutter along Ridge Street because by osmosis, some of that water would go into the cemetery and assimilate into the ground, but it was increased. I have a question. The first question is this. For those of us along this area that have been damaged and been hurt by this water, and there are many of us sitting in this room, will we be made whole? My neighbors, the Snyders, have a sinkhole because the water is beginning to swirl beneath their property. My pipe that I put in has been there now for 24 years, and I'm concerned about the same thing. And you showed something. And by the way, gentlemen, a wonderful presentation. And it was not too much information. It was great. But I asked you this. You mentioned something about lining existing pipes to make them whole or to increase the efficiency and the performance of these pipes. That's part of looking back and correcting some of the problems. Is this true, Mr. Parker and gentlemen? And I don't mean to push you on timeline, but question I always have in this room is when. You know, we're ready. We've been ready for 2 decades, but others for serious conditions with 4 or 5 years. But that, I've got those 2 questions. Thank you so much for the evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayfield. I think the city's full intent is to try as best we can in this basin to provide the relief that you all have been, especially that have lived for decades and have seen this change over time, to provide relief. I'm going to ask Rich to address the question about the lining. The beauty of technology and the future is that repair techniques that are available to us today were not available to us even 5 or 10 years ago. One of those technologies is lining. And so Rich has had, although the city has not ever hired a contractor to come in and do that specialty work, Rich has been a part of this, and in the greater Atlanta area, there's been a lot of lining because it's a much more cost-effective way to stabilize an older pipe. Many of you may remember last March, we had the big sinkhole come up on Rocky Face Estate subdivision. We had to do an emergency repair that was, again, one of these older metal pipes that has a lifespan of 25 to 30 years in some cases. We spent $120,000 on an emergency repair lining that pipe. Probably could have been done for less than $20,000, and the road was closed for 3 weeks. Folks couldn't get into their homes. Luckily, it was not one of those 1A pipes that Rich mentioned, because there was a second way of getting in and out of the subdivision. But still, I think that speaks to the effectiveness of this lining technology. Rich, I'll just let you describe what that means and how it's done.
So as a stormwater group, as a professional. As a stormwater group, one of our big regrets that we have is we allowed corrugated metal pipe, which is, since you live there, that's what's under the Snyder's property. We allowed pipes to go in that had a 25-year level of service or life expectancy, and they're just old. I mean, unfortunately, we use that. I don't know why, 30 years ago, we didn't think about, 25, 30, 40 years down the road, we're going to have to deal with these. And so the lining technology, so let's pretend this is a pipe, and you've seen Mr. Snyder, Mr. and Mrs. Snyder's pipe, it's got holes in. What they can do is they can pull a sled that'll go through the pipe, and it lays down very thin layers of concrete and builds up successive layers. And they get up to maybe an inch. We're talking about maybe an inch thick of concrete. Now, I'm calling it concrete, and if you saw it, it looks like concrete mortar. It just doesn't have a lot of rock in it. To give you some examples, most of concrete that you'll order today is 3,000 PSI concrete. That's the strength of it. This stuff is 8,000 PSI with no rock in it. It's incredibly hard. And when it cures, it basically builds a smooth wall pipe inside the old pipe. And the advantage of that is, and where we really like to use it is, anytime we get in a situation like, let's say we're going under a road, to replace that pipe, we got to dig up the road. We got to deal with the water line. There's probably a sewer line. You guys lose cable, and then everybody that's working remotely from home starts screaming. And it's not, hard to get past $100,000. Whereas we might be able to line this pipe for $10,000, $15,000. It happens in one day. That road will be dug up for a month or two. And so that's why we really like this lining, is it provides that smooth wall interior. So, the one thing water, it wants a smooth wall to go past. It doesn't like bumping along those ridges in that corrugated metal pipe, like in the backyards that we're talking about. And so even though we lose maybe an inch of diameter, that smooth wall allows us to move through faster. And so that's why we're talking about lining these pipes. Is it increases efficiency, but then also remember, we're reducing the flows through the cemetery so that we can put in that bypass pipe and move that water. We're just basically changing the way the water flows through downstream. So instead of going through the backyards, it's going down the public right of way. And so that's the ultimate goal, is to try to take all that water off of Emery Street, not all of it, almost all of it, off of Emery Street and off of the cemetery, and move it around the homes instead of making it go through y'all's pipes. And so that's where you guys will see the big advantage. And then I think your second question was about timing. Our pipe is the plans for the cemetery. Like, Andrew said, we're at 60%. 60% is a little bit of a misnomer. A 60% set of plans, you could go out and build it tomorrow. That are designed, this is the ones that we'll be using for permitting. So we'll go through, once we finish this up and everybody kind of agrees, we've got to deal with a few little details, not with the design itself, but with things like, when we tear up the roads, how are we going to repair them in the cemetery, and if we're running equipment up and down that. So that's what's left, is permitting and getting a few details left. And then these plans are done. And then the city can, proceed forward with their procurement for getting a contractor out there. And then once that's in place, then we can start talking about, the elements of the project that are really going to move that needle for you guys.
The only thing. So again, one of these guys' jobs as designers is to develop a staging plan so that as the work's being performed, folks maintain access. We're never going to create a scenario where you would be trapped out. If there was something like that, it would be like, we're going to coordinate with you at the time that's convenient for you. Please park on the street for this day so we can get concrete poured back or something like that. But it wouldn't be an indefinite closure or anything like that. We're going to do our best to minimize disruption to everybody. The only thing I'll add to what Rich said is part of that process, as I mentioned earlier, as was kind of overviewed in the city code, we've got to secure easements. We can't, other than if you voluntarily provide easements to us, we can't legally work on your property. So during that process, we'll concurrently, if you're one of the pipes that they're proposing to line or where work is to be performed, we're going to be coordinating with you this entire process to get those, secure those easement interests that would have to be approved by the city council. So what I think we said the second council meeting in February was when the corrective action plan was approved. That allowed us to have this meeting to engage you, because we couldn't take this step until we knew that the council was in favor of doing the project, since it involving so many public and private lands. And so we're really now in the home stretch. This is a key moment for us as a city to get your feedback, continue to fine tune the elements of the plan that are outside the cemetery based on your feedback and based on the model. And we'll continue to coordinate with you until this plan is seen through. Jorge, did we have any questions on YouTube? I think we had 12 different people on YouTube as well. So any final questions? And again, we'll be here tonight if you've got a very specific question. I think we talked to a few of you about looking at some plans in greater detail. So we'll be glad to stay. And then we'll be back again Thursday. If you would like to participate, or you have a question that comes up in the process between now and next Thursday, you can always reach us. I would like for Jackson Shepherd to be the point of contact for the city to assimilate all this information, because he's the liaison between the Public Works Department that's overseeing the plan development, my office, as well as the Arcadis team. So we'll make sure that if you've signed in and left an email, we'll send you Jackson's contact information. That way we'll have, you can always have an open channel communication with us. Any other questions before we close the formal session?
Hey, I'm Diane Williams. I'm at 622 McFarland Avenue. So of course, we've had a lot of the actual flooding in the yard and actually right up to the house. But one thing I wanted to ask, I keep hearing things about you don't really know an exact timeline in phase 1 and phase 2. I mean, I'm just kind of trying to get an idea, because I'm sure you kind of have a proposed timeline. I mean, are we thinking, you know, a year? Are we thinking 2 years or 5 years? I mean, what is kind of your idea? I know it's not set in stone, but what is your idea about how long all this is going to take?
I'll speak maybe to the city side, and then Rich, if you want to chime in on the plan development side. Some aspects of the plan will require us to obtain permits from the state, just because a lot of the waters within the basin are considered what we call, it's a term of art, state water. So it's a jurisdictional waterway that the EPD and EPA have jurisdiction over. So even though we say, you know, if the city takes easement and does this work, you know, we could have easement to do maintenance, we still have to go to them on some respects of this project. And typically, sometimes those permits might take up to 90 days, which is another reason why it's so critical for us in the cemetery, because we don't really have to have as much involved permitting. And concurrent with that, as we work on the plan development for the second 2 phases, we can apply for those permits so we don't have any downtime. My goal, we're at the beginning of 2022. I would like to see this plan done in the course of 2 years. I think that is an aggressive schedule based on a permitting timeline that we don't totally have control over. But I would like to see this full scenario E, the full plan. My objective to staff would be to try to get this executed by the end of 2024 or by the end of 2023. That was what was so critical about the council in the second meeting of February this year. I mean, second meeting of January of this year, approving that plan. By them adopting that corrective action plan, it goes into our capital projects list that Rich mentioned earlier. Doesn't mean it rises to the very top, but it means it gets on that plan. So as funding is allocated, and again, I've been assured that funding will not be an issue for this. My charge is develop the plan, develop the process for getting this done over a 2-year period. So to that question, I would say that yes, based on the fact that the council approved the plan, it's added to our capital projects list now. Now that assumes, you know, that each property owner will work with us to provide the easement. That's the catch in this, is that if somebody doesn't participate, it's all going to be voluntary participation. So assuming that we all work together, we get the plans done, we put Rich and his team on notice to get these plans done, and we have 2 more sets of plans just like that for phase 2 and phase 3. It's in our projects list. We're going to be actively working on it. Any other questions before we adjourn? Okay, thank you for coming out. And again, come up if you have any specific questions. I know we've talked to a few of you about looking in a little bit more detail on your property. So if we've done that, please come up and we'd be glad to do that. Thank you for coming tonight.